A wasteland, a once upon a time beautiful land that gradually became barren. Now, if this condition is not reversed, it will continue to spread death and devastation around it. Now, this land behind me is a sad reflection of the pandemic we are in right now. But there's a pandemic much bigger and worse than COVID. Now, the bad news is you and I are in this bigger pandemic. But the good news is there is a way to overcome it. So what is this bigger and much worse pandemic? Are you ready? It's the pandemic caused by sin. But today's passage will show you how to overcome the pandemic of sin so that you can go from a condition of death and devastation into a new state filled with life and joy. So that is our topic today, how to overcome the pandemic of sin. In short, how can you reverse the effects of sin? Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 5, verse 1 up to chapter 6, verse 10. Now, what's interesting about Genesis 5 is that at first glance, this chapter is one of the most boring chapters in the entire Old Testament. But don't be fooled, because once we are done, I assure you, you won't view this chapter the same way again. Now, there are three things you will see today: the root of the pandemic, the result, and how to reverse the pandemic of sin. Now, let's look first at the root of sin's pandemic. Now, if we look at the bigger context, the root is man's attempt to have independence from God. Now, independence from God is defined as doing whatever one decides as good for oneself. As early as Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve showed independence by eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil because they thought that their choice is better than depending on what God said to them. In Genesis 4, Cain showed independence by assuming that the best solution to his problem is to kill his brother instead of trusting God. And because of his example, Cain's wicked lineage practiced bigamy and brutality. Now, in Genesis chapter 6, even the godly line of Seth demonstrated their independence from God by intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain. Now, because of independence from God, the humans God created and called very good in chapter 2, He now calls it evil in chapter 6. He regrets making them and eventually, disgusted by them, destroyed them. My friend, the temptation to choose whatever we decide to be good rather than following God is always there. For example, when looking for a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or a spouse, do you depend on God's idea or follow your own idea? Do you base your decision on beauty or the Bible? How about our money? Are we tempted to think that God's idea of putting Him first with our tithes and offerings is impractical, especially during this COVID season, and that we should spend our money rather than other things? Or whose idea do we follow when it comes to controversial topics such as sexuality, marriage, racial theory, or even entertainment? Do we follow culture or God's idea but possibly be cancelled by culture? My friend, I feel you. To be independent of God feels alluring. But that's just the beginning. Gradually, it leads to loss of godliness and invites retribution from a grieving God. Independence from God only leads to destruction. It's never good at all. So what is the result? This leads us to the second point, the result of sin's pandemic. In summary, the result is death. And death affects both the godly and the ungodly. Now let's look at Genesis 5, the list of Seth's godly line. It begins with the first founder of humanity, Adam, and ends with the refounder of humanity, Noah. But before we read the passage, Bible scholars aptly observes a formulaic structure. Every time a patriarch is mentioned, you will see these 4 lines. The first line says, A, referring to a patriarch, lived X, referring to the number of years. Then the second line mentions A, or that particular patriarch, fathering B, or a son. Now the third line then mentions A, then lived Y, or number of years, after he fathered B and had sons and daughters. Then the last line always ends with the phrase, all the days of A, that patriarch, were Z, or the sum total of all his years, and he died. Now those last 3 words, and he died, always ends every patriarch's life, a reminder of sin's consequence. So let's start with Adam. Genesis 5:3-5 says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Did you notice how the writer of Genesis followed the formula? And he always ends with those ominous 3 last words, and he died. Now look at the next patriarch, Seth. Genesis 5:6-8 says, when Seth hath lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enos 807 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Again, it followed the formula. Now look at the next patriarch, Enosh. Genesis 5:9-11 says, when Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enos lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. Every single person mentioned in Genesis 5 not only followed the formula, but every person ended with the ominous and inevitable end of every human. And he died. But wait, there are 2 individuals in Genesis 5 and 6 that deviated from the formula. They were the only 2 that did not end with the phrase, and he died, because they were the only 2 who found a way to reverse the pandemic of sin. My friend, are you interested to know what these 2 individuals did? Why do you want to know? Because what they did is still applicable for you and me today. This is the point of the whole chapter. It's the author's way of grabbing your attention to show you how to reverse the pandemic of sin. So who are they, and what did they do? This leads us to the 3rd point, namely, how to reverse sin's pandemic. Now before I give you the answer, let's read what they did. The first was Enoch. Genesis 5:21-24 says, when Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Now Enoch walked with God. Oh, that's the praise not seen from the other patriarch. The verse continues, after he fathered Methuselah 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Oh, did you notice the repetition of that phrase? By the way, when a phrase is repeated in the Bible, it means it's crucial. Pay attention to it. So what happened because he walked with God? The verse continues, and he was not. That means he did not die, for God took him. Whereas all the patriarchs died, he did not die because he walked with God. Now, what does walking with God mean? It means they accompany each other. Wherever God decides to go, Enoch goes. If God walks in the darkness and the valley, Enoch won't abandon God even though it's tough and he can hardly breathe in the dark valley. Why? Because he enjoys God's companionship and closeness more than human companionship. Now, Enoch is God's very intimate friend. They are always together. Now, do you have a best friend that you love hanging out with? He or she is your best friend because you have the same taste in movies, music, or food. You have similar likes and dislikes in activities, sports, or leisurely activities. And you love talking in person or over the phone even until the wee hours of the morning. That's why you walked together all the time. Now, in the same way, walking with God happens because your taste, say in movies and music, is similar to that of God's. What God likes and dislikes are also your likes and dislikes. And you love talking to God even to the wee hours in the morning. That's what walking with God means. By the way, the verb to walk is hitfa'el in Hebrew, and it underscores repetitiveness. In other words, Enoch's walking with God was habitual and continuous. He had maintained this submission to the will of God and intimacy with God for all his 365 years. In summary, reversing the pandemic of sin is through intimacy with God, not independence from God. Intimacy with God, not independence from God. Also, did you notice that Enoch has the shortest lifespan among the patriarchs? As one scholar say, perhaps it is an indication that longevity is not what is most laudable. Now, how old was Enoch? 365. Listen to how skillful the writer of Genesis is. One scholar found that there are 365 words in Genesis chapter 5. Now, 65 words make the passage an Enoch. There are 200 words before it and 100 after. Now, this scholar considers this to be an indication of the fullness of Enoch's life. Limited, but full and pleasing to God. In short, the one who walked with God, God makes an exception. He did not die. Now, the second deviation from the formula was Noah. Read with me Genesis 5:32. It says, after Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, the first deviation is that instead of mentioning one son, it mentioned three. The second deviation is instead of saying he died, chapter 5 ended. Why the departure from the formula? What's happening? Jump to Genesis 6, 8, and 9. It says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Now look at the next phrase. Noah walked with God. Wow! Look at those last four words. Noah walked with God. Do those words look familiar again? In short, whereas God destroyed all humanity by sending a flood, Noah and his family did not die because Noah walked with God. Of course, he eventually died, but in this pericope, he and his family were the only ones who did not die from the sure death God showered upon the entire humankind. In short, it's safe to conclude that what reverses the sad downward spiral of humanity is to walk with God. The very thing that God desired from Adam and Eve in the garden before. Intimacy with God, not independence from God. Would you like to try God's formula? You might like it. So, how can you develop intimacy with God? 3 action plans. The first is to make sure you are spiritually alive. It doesn't mean that because you are breathing, you are also spiritually alive. No. It just means that you are operating what the Bible calls as the natural person or the natural man. Now, the natural man or person does not want to obey God and instead hates the things of God. So, how can you develop intimacy with God if you are just alive naturally but not spiritually? Now, if you are wondering whether you are spiritually alive or not, talk to me. If you want to make sure that you are spiritually alive, allow me to show you the way. How? I invite you to go to this link, fill up the questionnaire, and I will get in touch with you. I will contact you. And if you go to this link, I will also give you a Bible as my gift to you. Now, the second is to view Him as your best friend. God is indeed your best friend. He's always looking for your best interest, even though His words and what He wants you to do may not feel right and may feel like it's the opposite of good. But that's what real best friends do. They give you what you don't necessarily want to hear, but what you need to hear. That's the Holy Spirit. He is your best friend. So don't believe Satan's lie that God is not fun to be with. God is your best friend. But more importantly, Jesus is your Lord. So submitting to Jesus' Lordship is in your best interest. Now, the third is to cling to Him and His Word even though it hurts. This is your part of the equation. To fully trust and obey Him even though the world is ridiculing you. You know, when Noah built the ark, he suffered ridicule almost every day for many, many years. But he got the last laugh. So cling to Him and His Word. Now, to all of you who are watching this video, what would happen if we decided to walk with God? How about if, unlike Abraham's dilemma, where there were not enough righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, resulting in those 2 beautiful cities being destroyed, how about if there were enough of God's people who will decide to walk with God intimately? How about if we walk with God no matter what, whether we might experience a cancel culture or not? What do you think will happen? Would you like to know the result?